Okay, we are bringing lights down. So for good images, right?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Good morning. Morning. Thanks for coming. Sorry it's kind of a refrigerator in here. Just get close, I guess, and stay warm if you can. Welcome and thanks for coming to Art of Environmental Justice in an Expanded Field, a symposium on creative activism and eco-politics across boundaries. I'm Alan Braddock, and I'm the Barron Visiting Professor of Environment and Humanities at Princeton. This event is one in an ongoing series addressing global perspectives on environmental justice, sponsored by the Princeton Environmental Institute, also known as PEI. Oops. Tomorrow afternoon, there will be another event, Standing Rock from the Eyes of Three Filmmakers at 4:30 in McCormick Hall 101, featuring screenings and discussion with directors Heather Ray, Cody Lusich, and Julie Bridgham. So I invite you to attend that event as well. I also want to thank a number of people here at Princeton for making these events possible. Kathy Hackett, Laura Mateka, Raj Chokshi, Stacy Christian, Igor Heifetz, Francis Juhaj, Angela Petsis, and Heidi Mihalik at PEI provided crucial administrative, organizational, and technical support. So thank you. Rob Nixon, Anna Arabinden Kesson, and Ann McClintock have graciously agreed to lead discussion as panel moderators for today's event. By the way, Rob Nixon and Ann McClintock deserve special credit for their really strong support for the environmental humanities, not just here at Princeton, but across that ever-expanding field. So thanks to them. Today we hear and see presentations from 9 remarkable artists, visual artists, who will discuss their creative work in environmental justice issues. Active in various media and contexts around the world, these artists demonstrate the power of imagination to rethink and revise the politics of ecology in a global perspective, while also attending to local situations. The term environmental justice tends to conjure ideas about law and science, but these artists use creative interdisciplinary approaches and public modes of address. Their work bears witness to environmental conditions and inequities, but it does something else too, something that art is particularly well equipped to do. Their work startles us and makes us pay attention. It inspires participation and helps people see from other points of view. By imagining things we haven't pondered before, these artists also show us that current eco-political realities are not necessarily foreclosed, that they might change in the future, for worse or for better. Moreover, by creatively confronting problems of environmental justice in an international perspective, they expand the parameters of art itself. In this moment, at a time when a growing number of scientists, historians, and other scholars agree that our planet has entered a new geological epoch known as the Anthropocene, in which human activity has become the primary driver of environmental change, and inequality has assumed monstrous proportions, an expansive view of art and ecology looks inevitable and necessary. How do we define environmental justice? In the broadest sense, it concerns the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, as well as the inclusive recognition and representation of stakeholders with diverse points of view. As a movement, environmental justice involves the pursuit of fairness in matters of ecology through various means, from enforcement of environmental regulations to political lobbying to enact and change laws, efforts to address legacies of environmental discrimination, scientific and social research on environmental impacts, and many other kinds of activity, including cultural activity exploring the meaning and interpretation of environmental conditions in various communities. In other words, environmental justice is an interdisciplinary project in which art can play an important role through critical strategies of visualization, imagination, and public engagement. Artists may use legal, scientific, or policy research as part of their process, but they can also reconfigure materials and relationships in provocative ways in order to produce new insights and interventions. Environmental justice has a rich and complicated history. American scholars have tended to locate the origins of environmental justice activism in the United States in the 1970s and 80s. In that context, the movement appeared as a critical response to Earth Day and mainstream white environmentalism, amid growing recognition that poor people and communities of color experienced disproportionate levels of pollution and other environmental burdens. David Hare's article on Black ecology, published in April of 1970, just as the first Earth Day was happening, is an important example of this critical response. Environmental justice activism was an extension of the civil rights movement, feminism, labor struggle, the American Indian movement, and other social justice work, which also manifested in various visual forms. Posters promoting the United Farm Workers grape boycott, street theater by the performance ensemble Black Survival in St. Louis, and Wayne Eagleboy's American flag painting on buffalo hide with barbed wire. By 1987, during grassroots protests against the siting of industrial facilities, Dr. Benjamin Chavis coined the term environmental racism and published a report for the United Church of Christ on toxic wastes and race in the United States. Another important watershed in the emergence of the environmental justice movement was the first National People of Color Environmental Justice Leadership Summit held in Washington, D.C. in 1991. By the mid-1990s, a wave of academic research and government proclamations, including a 1994 executive order by President Bill Clinton, had established environmental justice as a key term in American public discourse. But the origins and scope of environmental justice extend beyond this late 20th century American context to an even broader and older history involving many other sites around the world, revealing long-standing structural inequities of global proportions rooted in colonialism and empire. A few examples from art history illuminate this deeper, more far-reaching context. For example, in 1992, the African-American painter Carrie James Marshall made this large allegorical picture about apartheid in South Africa, featuring the springbok as a national symbol pierced with an arrow and surrounded by other emblems, including references to European colonialism, as well as gold, uranium, and diamond mining industries that had propped up the racist regime. A decade before, the Indian photographer Raghu Rai produced this and many other iconic photographs expressing outrage about the Bhopal disaster, in which thousands died and many more were badly injured in the aftermath of a catastrophic leak of methyl isocyanate gas at a Union Carbide factory. During the 1960s, the Japanese photographer Shisei Kuwabara critically interpreted the effects of industrial mercury poisoning caused by the Chiso chemical factory at Minamata. Looking back even earlier to the 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance painter Aaron Douglas produced this monumental mural series for the New York Public Library, exploring what he called aspects of Negro life as a complex historical narrative of social and environmental struggle from Africa to the urban American metropolis. art historians like me have a lot of work to do to reconstruct this deeper, broader history of creative work relating to environmental justice. But a sense of that longer trajectory already informs a recent literary anthology titled Sharing the Earth, an International Environmental Justice Reader, edited by Elizabeth Ammons and Madhumita Roy, both professors of literature at Tufts University, and published in 2015. Their book contains key writings by recent environmental activists, including Vandana Shiva, Wangari Maathai, Simon Ortiz, Ken Saro-Wiwa, and many others. But it begins with several early texts, such as Lao Tzu's Those Who Would Take Over the Earth, as well as a traditional Lakota story about Iktomi, the trickster, a 17th century declaration from the poor oppressed people of England, a short story by Rabindranath Tagore, and a WPA slavery narrative by a woman named Snovey Jackson, among many others. Sharing the Earth provides an interesting model for rethinking environmental justice over centuries. It's exactly with this sort of model in mind that I'm working with the Princeton University Art Museum on a 2018 exhibition that will challenge conventional Anglo-centric national narratives about the geography and chronology of art history and environmental justice. The exhibition will have a deliberately ironic title, Nature's Nation, intended to prompt critical reflection about US exceptionalism and political ecology over more than 3 centuries. Back to the painful present, where forces of market fundamentalism reassert themselves in particularly hideous Orwellian forms. In this context, environmental justice could not be a more urgent topic of creative activism, especially given the powerful forces currently unleashed against it. We all know that President Trump and his EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, have both publicly questioned the scientific consensus about climate change while promising to remove environmental regulations, all in the name of jobs and economic nationalism. But their program goes even farther. They also plan to dismantle EPA environmental justice programs, a fact that prompted Mustafa Ali, the senior advisor for those programs, to resign last month. As indicated in this Washington Post article, Ali had helped found the EPA's Environmental Justice Office 2 decades ago and had worked under Democratic and Republican administrations since then. But he decided to resign when he learned of a budget proposal to completely defund the program. In this new climate of federal defunding and deregulation, artistic engagement will likely be more important than ever. Once again, though, let us remember that the US is only part of a global matrix of environmental justice concerns and contexts, in which space and distance function with considerable force. As explained by the editors of this recent MIT book on environmental inequalities beyond borders, quote, a critical aspect of global environmental inequality that has emerged involves a spatial disconnect between public consumption and the desire for profitability by multinational corporations in one part of the world, and the environmental and human rights burdens these drivers impose on others. Under such conditions, art can intervene productively by operating at different sites and scales in order to overcome the disconnect that insulates enclaves of consumption from the broader global community. Before we get started, I need to say a word or two about the unwieldy title of this symposium, specifically the phrase expanded field, which art historians will recognize as a cliché. The phrase alludes to an influential article published in 1979 by the art historian Rosalind Krauss in the journal October. Her article, titled Sculpture in the Expanded Field, offered a structuralist analysis of postmodernism, a new development in late 20th century art in which the traditional categories of artistic media like sculpture, painting, architecture, etc., were breaking down. Artists were freely mixing and merging media as they wished. Focusing on the history of Western sculpture, Cruz traced a trajectory of change over 2,000 years, from classical treatments of sculpture as monument, as in the ancient Roman Marcus Aurelius statue at left, to what she called the nomadic portability and homelessness of modernist sculpture, as in Brancusi's The Beginning of the World in the center. According to Cruz, late 20th century postmodernist work like Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, which you see at right, signaled a rupture from sculptural tradition in its combination of elements on a large scale, in this case, tons of stone and earth, marking a site on the Great Salt Lake in Utah. At a time when it seemed like anything goes in contemporary art, Cruz attempted to find order by using a diagram to map what she saw as the structural oppositions and permutations defining sculpture in the new expanded field of postmodernism. In this scheme, traditional sculpture has become just one medium in a range of intersecting options that include landscape, architecture, site constructions, and other possibilities. In a particularly interesting passage of her essay, Cruz defended the expanding field of postmodern art against modernist critics by saying, quote, "This continual relocation of one's energies is entirely logical, even if it moves continually and erratically beyond the domain of sculpture." Moreover, she said, within the situation of postmodernism, practice is not defined in relation to a given medium, like sculpture, but rather in relation to the logical operations on a set of cultural terms, for which any medium, photography, books, lines on walls, mirrors, or sculpture itself, might be used. In other words, in this defining articulation of artistic postmodernism, Cruz credited multimedia work across boundaries as a logical operation for addressing cultural terms. As a self-described formalist, Cruz had no professional interest in an art of environmental justice, but her formal analysis endorsed artistic strategies that have become increasingly useful and necessary in an era of globalization, mass migration, and the international outsourcing of ecological burdens. Almost exactly 10 years ago, a conference held at Princeton in this very auditorium examined the legacy of Cruz's article, but the postmodern geographies of environmental justice apparently did not come up in discussion. They will today, now that the Anthropocene has made them inescapable. The extraordinary artists presenting on this occasion fully engage the cultural terms of environmental justice, using logical operations and media as they see fit. They work in a variety of contemporary contexts and forms, exploring inequities associated with climate change, food, toxic pollution, genetic engineering, immigration, colonialism, extinction, indigenous land rights, and more. Their remarkable work expands two fields: the field of postmodern art, described by Cruz, and the field of environmental justice itself, which becomes more interdisciplinary every day. We often learn about contemporary art from critics and art historians like me, but today we can enjoy the luxury of hearing directly from the artists themselves. So let's get started. The symposium is divided into 3 two-hour sessions. one in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. Each session will consist of presentations by 3 visiting artists, followed by an informal moderated discussion with audience questions. You're all invited to lunch at Guillot Hall, as well as a reception at Guillot following the symposium. Let me now introduce our first speaker. Ravi Agarwal is our first speaker. He lives and works in New Delhi. Trained as an engineer, he is the founder of the Indian NGO Toxics Link, which has pioneered work in waste and chemicals in India and campaigns on conserving the river and the forest in Delhi. He has also served on several prominent government committees and United Nations Environment Program treaty processes. In 1997, he received the Ashoka Fellowship for Social Entrepreneurship. In 2008, he earned the UN Special Recognition Award for Chemical Safety. Over the past quarter century, working in tandem with his scientific and policy pursuits, Ravi has emerged as a leading interdisciplinary artist and activist, creating photographs, videos, and public art projects engaging ecology, society, urban space, and capital. His creative work has been published and exhibited widely, including at Documenta 11, Indian Highway, the Sharjah Biennial, and the Kochi Biennial. He has also curated important projects, including the Yamuna Elba Public Art and Ecology event in Chennai. He writes beautifully and has published extensively in multiple overlapping modes: scientific, literary, and art critical. I look forward to hearing his words and seeing his images now. Please join me in welcoming Ravi Agarwal.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Alan, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here in this beautiful campus. So I will like to show you 3 bodies of work which deal with the idea of what I call ecological alienations of various sorts. And if time permitting, I might mention a 4th recent art activity I was part of. This is just a slide to show my NGO office, just to tell you that my practice is both as an artist, but also as Alan mentioned, I intervene in many areas of environmental policy and practice. The first work I'd like to talk about is one of my most recent works, where I've been working with a fisherman in the south coast of India, a person called Selvam. And he's one of those traditional fishermen who live on the coastline of South India and fish in traditional ways, which means they use old boats which look like this. They're 2,000-year-old boats, and which I discovered during my 3-year-long engagement with this community, is that this boat is called the Kattumaran, or what we normally know as the catamaran. Kattumaran in Tamil, old classical Tamil, essentially means tied wood. And when you're on this boat 2 miles into the sea, there's very little between you and the sea itself, just a piece of wood, and it's quite scary to be there. During my engagement over but it's now been 3 years with this community, and in particular with this particular person, I got a chance to examine the very complex ecological connections and narratives which emerge from the ground up. And it was my attempt to bring some of these to the fore. They range from issues of larger changes happening around the coastline because of new ports which are coming up, which change the nature of the sand on the beach itself and change the way in which a fisherman like him can launch a boat like this. But also the changing nature of the fish stock because of large trawlers, which are, can go 25 miles or 30 miles into the sea, compared to a rowing fisherman like him or paddling fisherman like him, who can go less than 2 miles into the sea. And the inability of somebody like him to participate in the changes. And I'm particularly struck by the fact how much poverty and the poor are mobilized in global international negotiations on climate change or any other international environmental negotiations. But when you see them from the ground up, there's very little, they are the people who are marginalized, and within the narrative of the nation state also, there's very little addressal to the changes and the loss of access they have to their own livelihood. So that was one aspect which I was looking at. This particular frame is a series of photographs taken at 4 o'clock between 4 and 6 o'clock in the morning, when I, in a foolhardy manner, without a life jacket, went out 2 miles in the sea on him, and suddenly discovered that I was in the middle of the deep ocean with nothing between me and the ocean except my camera and Selvam, who might or might not save me in case I fall. And I did ask him that, Selvam, will you save me if I fall in the water? And he said, do you mean you can't swim? So certainly I said, not 2 miles out in the ocean. But what I wanted to say through this is that the complete vulnerability I felt and the change in personal position when I was out there, and suddenly I was a different person. And all my narratives about ecology, narrative, and environment became just that, narratives, because here I was struggling with the limits of my own body. This is another work which is part of that body, which talks about the difference in which even rudimentary technology makes to the life of such a person. So the hierarchies on the ground up are so intense that one doesn't realize them till one goes there. And what one sees that even the $3,000 or $4,000 required to get a boat with an engine like this, which changes the total economy of the fisherman and can take the person out 25 kilometers into the sea as against 2 kilometers. If you can't afford that little engine, you are really sunk. You cannot move up. You are caught in the trap of endless poverty. And all government programs which provide that idea of engine as the future, it's not necessary that everybody is able to access those $3,000 or $4,000. While I was talking to that community over the period of time, I was having multiple conversations with them. I don't know the language. They speak Tamil, which has a different lineage from the North Indian languages, but also they know some words of English. So over time, you struggle with the English they know. And I wanted to know about the relationship to the sea. And this work came after 2.5 years of taking those notes. And I found not once did they evoke the word nature. And I, as a city-bred person, came to the sea and saw the sea as this beautiful or this awesome or this unfathomable sea as a description about some landscape. But in no conversation did I hear any such description about the sea. The description was always in terms of the economic relationship, the political relationship, the lack of the changing weather of the sea, his ability or inability to go out there and to fish. And I was struck with this, with my narrative of nature vis-a-vis his relationship to the sea, and they seem to have no connections. And it brought me to think that the kind of abstraction which even somebody like me had was so much that I was not able to understand the connection or the idea of nature, what I call nature, which Selvam had. It also brought me, as I had been following writings of Timothy Morton, who writes about ecology without nature, and many other several references about this construct of nature. And it is at that time that I started looking at what his cultural references to the idea of nature is. Because it also is it's been a long-term query with me that are we caught, when we think of future sustainability of the planet, are we caught in a bind that we cannot imagine what that word means without thinking about the origins of that word, nature, what of that relationship has been. And it is during that time that I was talking to some local people who live there who are actually well-known writers in Tamil and poets. And I came across this body of literature called Sangam Poetry. Sangam Poetry is one of the oldest known poetries in the world. It's written, what is left of it is written around the time between 300 BC and 300 AD. And it's passed on through papyrus leaves, so it's been inscribed and reinscribed over time. And one aspect, one section of Sangam poetry, which is called Akam poetry or Aham poetry, deals with the idea of landscape. It describes 5 landscapes as exist in that particular area, region. And each landscape has a reference to emotion. And the poetry is written in a manner in which each landscape describes a kind of human love, a meeting. So the landscape of the forest or of the mountain will describe a furtive meeting. Landscape of the plains will describe a relationship with jealousy because it's more settled, or with competition of love. So different kinds of landscape, but the way the landscape is evoked is not metaphoric. So it's not evoked as, for example, the woman is not described as a woman with doe eyes, like much of Sanskrit literature you'll find. But it's evoked as a setting, and as a subtle setting which describes a particular mood of the kind of poetry. And this is part of the literature of the language which Selvam and his community speak. And it got me thinking of what kind of sea would he be seeing when I see it, and what are his cultural references? What would he really be thinking about deeply inside himself? What his relationship to the sea would be? And it's a reflection which I cannot answer very easily, but I wanted to shift the fixity about what nature might be thought of across cultures, across communities. And so this particular work is part of a series, and Mulai is one of the landscapes. It's like talking of 2 syntaxes, one of technology and development, and the other about what might have been a pre-modern way of thinking of nature. This is a boat in which I inscribed some of there are 3 major translations of that poetry, but three well-known translations, and this is part of one of the phrases from that poem. I also, as Alan graciously mentioned, I write as something which I like to do, and there's a book which got published called Ambient Seas, which documents my notes from a part of that period, and the photographs, because I take photographs regularly, and I treat them as documents. Some of them become something else, but they're also a very important part. I see documents as note-taking. I see photographs as note-taking. And as part of this work in the recent Kochi Muzlis Biennial, which just finished in Kerala, I was invited to participate, and I did one of my first 3-dimensional room installations. And I just wanted to share a bit of that with you. This is how part of the room looked. It's an old cabin which overlooks the sea, because the setting is on the sea. And what you see from the porthole, and there's a short video clip which I'd like you to hear. Sorry.
D1. Village Gossip. The cool blue flowers of the muli plants with curved spikes travel in the wind and lie scattered all over this sand beside the waters, like pearls scattered from a broken necklace. That's what it's like where your man comes from. I adore him, your mother likes him, and your father approves of him. The village gossip too is afoot, connecting you with him. Kuruntokai 117. Rain-soaked water lily. An egret resembling a rain-soaked water lily was looking for prey. A crab saw him and panicked.
Okay, just a small excerpt. It goes on for a while. There's a film of 38 minutes, a short extract of which I'll show you. It's about the current landscape, the politics of the coastal landscape in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu. So I just want to stop there and come to the next part of what I'm interested in is that if from the ground up the ecological connection or the ecological pressures are not a neat narrative. There are many complex things I see happening on the ground, and it's very hard for me to fix them in one category or the other. Of course, there's some dominant changes one is seeing because of the nature of change itself. There's a big capital-intensive growth happening, new ports coming up, new tourism coming up. But there are also other kinds of alienations happening, cultural alienations happening on the ground, probably which happened a long time back already. But there's almost an impossibility I see, or a great difficulty I see in a conversation about this together. The next work I want to show you is about a work which I did some time ago in 2002. It was a work done on migrant labor in India. I was asked to. I collaborated with a Dutch anthropologist called whose name is Professor Jan Bremen, who's done extensive work in India on labor migration. And he invited me to do a book with him, which looked at the internal migration of labor in a particular part of India called South Gujarat. It's a 2.5-year engagement looking at multiple kinds of reasons why people migrate from their local spaces into cities as urban labor. The reasons are both loss of land, loss of crop, loss of water, no access to other resources because of social hierarchies of caste and class. And I followed multiple types of work which people then form. And it was very interesting to spend time for over 2.5 years with a community which, a group of people which you don't normally see except from the outside. And it's pertinent to say that almost 90% of India's labor is informal sector labor. And informal sector labor is largely migrant labor. There are huge migrations of number of people who are constantly traveling for work across the country. And of course, the issue of migrants has become international, and now everybody's talking about it. But this has been an ongoing thing one sees. And the reasons for migration are very complex, and they could all be read in ecological terms as well, because the connection to natural resources, the connection to land, the ability to have capital, the ability to even access schemes, development schemes by the government, are largely dependent on social hierarchies and availability of skill. And what I discovered was that there is a row of people coming who are dying to come to cities, but the people who are working as informal sector in the city are the privileged lot of informal sector. Those who have no skill or no kith and kinship relationship in the city have no ability to enter the city and work there. And the migrants who come in, there are hordes of migrants which are coming into cities every day through every train, but then that doesn't necessarily mean that they can stay there. And I found that very interesting, especially in the current political conversations about the urban poor. The urban poor are often considered as people who do no work, are lazy, but it's not realized that to be urban poor, you have to be really productive. And you can't survive in a city like Delhi if you're not earning $100 a month, which is a lot of money, because you cannot pay for the mafia for your house, you cannot pay for food, you have no support system, and basically you cannot even find work. As you will see in many cities, that people are on this labor crossroad, called the labor chalk, looking for work. And those who have skills will have a little case with a masonry material in them or be a carpenter. But to acquire the skills, you need already connections. You cannot even acquire, there's no school giving you skills. To become a mason, you must have an uncle who was a mason, or somebody who's willing to teach you who's a mason. So at that level of existence, you have very little hope of any mobility. And you have very little hope of even going back, and because you have basically been evicted from the place where you live. It's this layer of humanity, of citizenship, which I'm really, really interested in. And like the small farmer, the small fisherman, it is that layer which is completely invisible. And I think these are the real ecological refs. So I can't think of the ecology as a neat narrative it is deeply interconnected with the hierarchies of social power and social class and creed. Just some pictures of the kind of work they find. It's all informal. Incidentally, the recent statistics show there's a increased informalization of labor as the economy becomes more formal, as labor unions are falling by the wayside. There's more and more contractual labor going on. That means people contract labor contractors to give whole, even large factories and large institutions, I know large newspapers are giving out whole contracts of running the press to contract labor. It sort of, in some sort of dubious way, distances them from the rights which labor might have of going on a strike or asserting rights of permanency or of other kinds of economic benefit which constant work accrues. Most of the work here is piece rate. That means you are working as much as you produce, and very often you find that people don't even take toilet breaks because they might produce less. So you find people just holding on and just working so that they might produce one more work. And the bulk of the economy, whether it's brick making, the big cities which are coming up, the brick making, the construction work, the waste picking work, this is where it is being done. These are the conditions which are being done. And I don't see a very clear trajectory of what's going to happen to them in the future, except I do see a lot more social marginalization with the rise of the middle class. People who are poor are desired less than they were earlier. This is a picture from a diamond cutting factory. And I must mention that I was allowed to do this work because of the workers themselves. This picture was taken at midnight when the workers said, you can come and take pictures now because our boss has left. So these are inaccessible places. If you're caught with a diamond, stealing a diamond, you'll probably be killed. This is where they live. And some of these factories have now modernized a bit, but they are part of the global economy. They're cutting global diamonds. So diamond from Belgium, it's Surat, where this picture is taken, is one of the largest diamond cutting places in the world. And this is, much of it is cut in these conditions. The third aspect I wanted to share with you is my work with the idea of the non-human. And I think that when we think of ecological alienations, we cannot not think of the non-human. And excuse me. This is the work I'm going to share with you about the extinction of vultures. I was a bird watcher for many years, and as you might know, South Asia had 10 million vultures from ancient times. They're mentioned in the ancient Hindu text of the Ramayana, where the vulture is one of the key birds mentioned. But since 1985, there has been a 99% extinction or decimation of the South Asian vulture. It's because of one pill called diclofenac made by a company called Novartis. It's a painkiller. The painkiller is also used to give to livestock because often the people who keep the livestock over-milk them and to make the animal at ease. But if the animal dies, then the medicine stays in the body of the animal, and the feeding vulture, it destroys the kidney of the feeding vulture. So there was a big campaign. I was part of it for many years to ban diclofenac, and it was the difficulty in having it banned was amazing. Ultimately, it got banned for human use, but it's still used it's banned for animal use, still used for, you can still find human doses. So I wanted to remind the city about the idea of extinction. This is a work done in 2010 in a public museum called the Museum of Natural History in Delhi, which unfortunately burned down last year, end of last year. And it straddles one of the busiest road crossings in the city. And the only two vultures left were in a diorama in that place. And part of what I did was to hunt or look around for a pair of nesting vultures, which were then placed along with the diorama as a sign of life. But also there's intervention in the museum itself with my old bird-watching diary, my drawings, and photographs. And this is just a short clip to show you the nesting vultures. And I took over the road outside and put my old photograph, which were from the same region, same area, same city, which you don't see the vultures anymore. And also, as I like to write, so all of my work has a diary or an essay or some reflections on that particular issue. And so this it was very interesting because when I took over this really busy roundabout, which is a corridor, which is a central Delhi and North Delhi corridor. So, hundreds and probably thousands of cars pass there in a few hours. And I was really worried what the traffic policemen might say, because I'm sort of impeding because people stop on the road and see. And I had an interesting conversation with a very senior traffic cop who came up to me and he said, "Whose work is this?" I said, "It's mine." And I was really worried that I'll get a scolding down. But he said, "Oh, I used to see these vultures in my village." the way immediately the conversation I had with him was so human and not at all about authority and what I was doing to the traffic, that it gave me great confidence in the idea of public art and the idea of public space, because part of the idea of that project was also to try and regain what public space might be, which is highly controlled in almost all cities I've worked in. Before I come to this final work, and I think I'm on time, one work which I don't have a picture of is I'd like to just mention that just before I came, I was invited to participate in a really interesting project run by an off-space in New Delhi. It's called Landscape as Evidence, Artist as Witness. It was a setting of a judicial setting with lawyers and a real judge, and a real case of river linking, which is going on in Delhi, in India, where they're trying to do a large interbasin transfer from one river basin to another. It'll run through 1/4 of a major tiger sanctuary, all in the name of providing water to another basin. And so 3 artists, including me, were invited to give evidence through our artwork. And it was very interesting because we were meant to only talk as artists through our work, but the idea of getting other forms of knowledge, which is not strictly what you might call fact in judicial terms, as evidence, became an interesting dialogue and opens up many possibilities of what might be considered as evidence, or what might be considered as fact, or what might be considered as the reality of landscapes. This is just, I leave you with this image, which is a work done in 2006. It's called The Shroud. It's basically performance-based work of 24 images. This is one of the 24 images. It refers both to the Hindu mythology of immortal life and death as a cycle, but also to the idea of the revival of nature and the river as an ongoing thing in a cycle of time. So I'll just end this, Alan, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ravi, for that wonderful presentation. Our next speaker, Amy Balkan, studied art at Stanford University from 2001 until 2003. She's produced a variety of cross-disciplinary and collaborative works that propose a reconstituted commons, considering legal boundaries and systems, environmental justice, and equitable sharing of common pool resources in the context of climate change. Her project sites have ranged widely from communities along the I-5 highway corridor near her home in San Francisco to the international locations of her work titled Public Smog, which seeks to designate Earth's atmosphere as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Other projects include a series of participatory public readings of documents from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of Parties process, the COP process. Her ongoing project, A People's Archive of Sinking and Melting, begun in 2012, gathers hundreds of crowdsourced items from people around the world, clothing, tools, and other materials, testifying to the contributors' awareness of sea level rise, coastal erosion, desertification, and other impacts associated with climate change. She has exhibited her work across the Americas, Europe, and Australia, and has worked in collaboration with numerous environmental organizations, including Greenpeace, Pond Art Activism and Ideas, and Green Action for Health and Environmental Justice. Please welcome Amy Balkan.
So just to begin, I just want to say I'm very happy to be here to participate. I'm really very excited to just have the opportunity to hear from the other practitioners who are here today, many of whose works I know well, and all of whose work I regard very highly. And I'm also very excited to have the opportunity to be in dialogue with Rob Nixon. So thank you very much. Today I'm going to discuss a few projects. The collaboration Invisible 5, which is a 2006 environmental justice tour of California's I-5 freeway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. Public Smog, a series of ongoing efforts to create a permanent clean air park in the atmosphere, and, as was just mentioned, a People's Archive of Sinking and Melting, a climate archive of the, quote, future anterior, or what will have been, archiving items contributed from people living in places that they deem to disappear in the future or, as already disappearing, becoming uninhabitable, owing to the combined physical, political, and economic impacts of climate change. Broadly linking environmental justice and spatial politics, these projects have paid particular attention to the invisible, the hidden, and the obscured, as in the difficult to directly observe atmospheric pollution and its effects in time on human health, weather and climate, or in exclusionary political processes, whether in the lack of Spanish translation at local permitting meetings in the San Joaquin Valley in California, or in intergovernmental climate proceedings, whether as jargon, political opacity, or police force. All these projects have been dependent on the participation and collaboration of many others, without which they could not take the shape I'll present today. And I'll begin with Invisible 5, which is a self-guided environmental justice audio tour along California's Interstate I-5 freeway between San Francisco and Los Angeles. It's a hybrid of a museum audio tour and environmental justice toxic tour intended to guide the listener along the freeway, investigating the stories of people and communities fighting for environmental justice along that corridor, using oral histories, field recordings, found sound, recorded music, and archival audio documents. The project also traces natural, social, and economic histories along the route. It was produced in 2006, an artist-led collaboration with Kim Stringfellow and Tim Halber, working with Bradley Angel and Marie Harrison of Green Action for Health and Environmental Justice, which is a multiracial grassroots organization that works with low-income and working-class urban, rural, and indigenous communities to fight environmental racism. So the I-5 is a critical pathway along the West Coast for trade, tourism, and migration, and functions as part of the infrastructure bundle that parallels it, supporting symmetrical movements of water, oil, and gas. Running along the valley's west side, the I-5 is also vital for intermodal shipping, has intensive ranching, farming, and dairying, housing development, waste dumping, and also has a gas and oil industry. And the I-5 itself is an intermodal corridor of economic significance, a category of freeway corridors that are most essential to the California economy in terms of national and international trade. The few sites that hint at the pollution along the route, such as the Covanta incinerator, a menacing black cube topped with smokestacks and surrounded by a 30-foot-high perimeter fence, or the visual and olfactory shock of the high-density feedlot just north of Coalinga, stand out like exclamation points. But as much of the pollution is transient, many of the tourist sites are fugitive. Communities in the San Joaquin Valley along the I-5 are often located just out of sight of the freeway, where easy truck access moves toxic waste to landfills through small towns like Patterson, Kettleman City, or Buttonwillow. In the areas around San Francisco and Los Angeles, communities sit under or adjacent to freeway traffic with homes, playgrounds, churches, and schools just yards from the freeway. Invisible 5 examines the historic reasons why polluting industries and businesses are unequally sited near poor rural and inner city communities of color in California through the oral histories of people fighting for environmental justice in that corridor. Sites which are represented here by these images include Wesley, the location of a major toxic tire fire, Crow's Landing, where plans to burn medical waste at the Covanta garbage incinerator were defeated by the Grayson Neighborhood Council, Buttonwillow, where Padres Hacia Un Vida Mejor unsuccessfully fought with the support of the Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment to close Clean Harbors, California's second largest Class 1 toxic waste dump. Unfortunately, they were only able to stop illegal deliveries of radioactive waste. And Pacoima in Los Angeles' San Fernando Valley, which has multiple threats to health and contaminants, including hexavalent chromium groundwater pollution from chrome plating, from Price, Pfister, and Holchem, 2 of 5 Superfund sites within Pacoima. As of 2015, 9 years after the tour was produced, hexavalent chromium was still being detected in groundwater. The first southbound stop on the tour is Bayview Hunters Point, a neighborhood in the southeast corner of San Francisco. At the time the tour was produced, Bayview Hunters Point was home to a Superfund site, the decommissioned Hunters Point Naval Shipyard site, a sewage treatment plant, 100 brownfield sites, 25 underground petroleum storage tanks, and more than a third of the city's 1,263 hazardous waste generators. And this is an image of Marie Harrison, seen holding a megaphone at a 2005 protest to shut the PG&E Hunters Point power plant in Bayview Hunters Point. While the plant was closed in 2006 after a successful fight by Green Action and the Hunters View Mothers Committee, when it was operating, it discharged over 300 tons of pollution into the air each year, including PM10, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and VOCs. Asthma has been one of the most serious environmental health challenges facing residents of Bayview Hunters Point. At the time the tour was made, 70% of residents were of African American or Asian descent, especially African American homeowners who had come up to work in the shipyard during World War II as part of the Southern migration. And Bayview Hunters Point rates of cervical and breast cancer were found to be double the rates found in other parts of the Bay Area. Hospitalization rates for congestive heart failure, hypertension, diabetes, and emphysema were more than 3 times the statewide average, and Bayview Hunters Point and the neighboring Potrero Hill neighborhood accounted for more than half of all infant mortality in the San Francisco area. And I'll just show you a few more images from the tour. This is a truck leaving the chemical waste Kelman Hills facility in the Central Valley, where an effort to expand that dump was successfully fought by residents of Kettleman City and what has since been recognized as a historic milestone for the environmental justice movement. This is an image of a fog in the basin of the Central Valley, which was once an inland sea. You can see this is just this ring, this mountains surrounding this basin. The geography is one of the few major influences on air quality in the valley, which has some of the worst air quality in the country. Tule fogs, which are inversion fogs, trap and hold small particles of dust and pesticide, making fogs more persistent and helping very small particles of pollution enter the lungs. This is an image of my collaborator, Tim Halber, conducting an interview near Buttonwillow, California, as Halliburton oil field workers look on. A few more images, and then I'll move on to the next project. This is an image from Clean Harbors, which Buttonwillow's Padres Hacia de un Vida Mejor, which was represented again by the Center Race Part of the Environment, fought to shut down. Well, I said they only found partial success in stopping illegal shipments of radioactive waste. That dump has since expanded to 320 acres. This is an image of oil pumping in Elk Hills, which is in the southern part of the Central Valley. The development of this pump technology in Elk Hills led to the extraction of asphalt to pave California's highway and to the technology transfer, which through enhanced water pumping from aquifers led to the large-scale industrial farming seen in the western San Joaquin Valley today, including high-value crops such as almonds and pomegranate, which you may see have become much less expensive and more available, and from high pesticide crops such as cotton. And this is an image of the Madres of East LA, who fought to close an incinerator in Boyle Heights in 2006. And while they were successful in that fight, as the neighborhood has become cleaner, now it's currently a center for conflicts over gentrification in Los Angeles, which I think, brings up this point about who does the hard work of fighting to protect a place from incineration, unequal siting, and then who benefits, especially in terms of changes in the desire for people to live in cities. Finally, I'll just show, this is an image of the website. I think in some ways I'm describing the project to you, but hopefully you'll have an opportunity to listen to the audio tracks if you're not able to travel to the I-5 and listen to it in a cited context. We, as a group, did many oral histories, and they're all audio tracks which you can download. And I feel like, ultimately the work itself sort of, in being able to listen speaks powerfully to these questions in a way that I'm not able to really encapsulate in my short talks. I'm hoping that you'll be able to take some time to listen to it. Besides the work and the way that it's represented, I think, for an audience that's moving down the I-5 or up the I-5, it has been presented nationally and internationally in art and critical cartography exhibitions. It's also been used to teach about environmental justice and its history. It's also been used as a tool to educate grant makers who wanted to fund women involved with environmental justice in California's Central Valley. And it's actually also been used as a reference in power plant siting scoping documents, none of which we would have anticipated, and I don't want to overstate, but it's been quite interesting for me to see. So I'm going to move from that project, just to let you know, the audio files, maps, directions, and all of that material is at invisible5.org. The next project I want to introduce, Public Smog, grew out of another ongoing work called This is the Public Domain, which I began in 2001 as an attempt to open a permanent public commons, what I still call a breathing space from capitalism's enclosures, with a handover of land to the global public using the framework of American law. The effort to date has involved the purchase of 2.5 acres of land in rural Kern County, California, and the search for a legal strategy by which to hand over all land rights to the global public, which has yet not produced a way forward for what I would call this space of unfreedom. In addition, mineral rights still need to be acquired from the Bank of America and other fractional mineral rights owners before a public handover might take place. And I just mention this as a way to introduce Public Smog. So in 2002 to 2003, while I was working to acquire land for This is the Public Domain, I first learned about regulated emissions trading, or cap and trade, a market-based mechanism which was integrated into the 1997 Kyoto Protocol for countries that committed to reducing their emissions to achieve those emissions reductions. It was included as a response to US lobbying for a market-based approach and first implemented through the World Bank Prototype Fund in 2000. Cap and trade creates, quote, allowances for polluting industries with a regulatory, quote, cap, in theory to be decreased in an ongoing way. If a polluting facility pollutes less than their allowance, such as through early implementation of emissions-reducing technology, they are left with credits at the year's end, which they can sell to a company that exceeds its set pollution cap. As I was looking to create a permanent public commons, I was really struck by the fact that sort of really thinking about the politics of land grabs, the destruction of the commons, that this was a new kind of atmospheric privatization that was happening. And that really made me think about what it might mean to open up an atmospheric clean air park, which I'll speak about in a moment. But I just want to talk a little bit more about the impacts of carbon markets since 2000. And so since that time, these markets have produced situations including incentivizing the overproduction of the powerful greenhouse gas HCFC 22 and a 71 billion euro windfall profits for some of the European Union's largest power companies in the European Union emissions trading scheme, and more importantly, as I'm sure people well know, displacing meaningful approaches for reducing emissions. And since 2003, the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide has grown from 375 parts per million to over 407 parts per million this month. Since emissions trading was initiated, it has been expanded to over 50 regulated markets, including California, the world's 12th largest emitter, where cap and trade was written into Assembly Bill 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, which doesn't account for, quote, fugitive emissions, such as the 83,000 metric tons of methane, an important greenhouse gas, released at the Porter Ranch in by Southern California Gas in 2016. But the problem with cap and trade isn't in its implementation, the lack of a carbon floor price, or market corruption, but rather fundamentally as the commodification of the atmosphere through speculative financialization, producing terrible dispossessions, to which in response I sought to open Public Smog, a correction in the shape of a clean air park in the atmosphere. So public smog is a park in the atmosphere that fluctuates in location and scale. It's a scheme to buy back your rights on the open market. It's no substitute for direct action. It won't save the Greenland pump, but it is particulate free. So what will the park be used for? Whatever. How will the park be constructed? However possible, through financial, legal, or political activities. Where is it? Public smog fluctuates in location, subject to prevailing winds and the long-range transport of aerosols and gases. If the park is created through activities in emissions markets and credits for nitrogen oxide or other smog-forming gas offsets are purchased, the lower park opens in the troposphere above the regulatory zone where those credits were obtained. If the right to emit carbon dioxide is purchased, the upper park opens in the stratosphere. Other activities to open public smog create different park sizes, locations, and opening dates. How will emissions offsets be purchased? Through regulated emissions trading markets. What type of emissions will be purchased? Smog forming or greenhouse gases. The lower park, when open, features particulate-free breathing and lower-risk athletic activity. Upper park activities include the ongoing terrestrial enjoyment of familiar birds and plants, glaciers, islands, and coastal areas. So in June 2004, the lower park first opened for public use above California's South Coast Air Quality Management District with the purchase of the right to emit 24 pounds of nitrogen oxide. In order to do that, I had to write a letter to file forms and submit a payment to the South Coast Air Quality Management District saying that I didn't have a facility and that it was for my own use. And I was able to, switch slides here. I was able to, with help from a trader who wished to be anonymous, make a trade. And as you can see here, I made this very small trade to purchase 24 pounds. The unit price was $4 a pound, which is interesting to think about now when you look at carbon dioxide prices. One thing that was also helpful to me was to have an opportunity to see something like this screenshot, right, which not only shows companies or facilities that are producing pollution, such as Trinity Oil or, let's see here, Nuevo Energy, but also you begin to see the entrance of brokers who are looking to capitalize on this new market, such as Cantor Fitzgerald. And I have my slides switched here, so I'll just say, once I made that purchase, without fanfare, the lower park opened for public use over Los Angeles, Orange, and Riverside counties until those credits expired 2 weeks later. In fall 2006, working with students from the Royal College of Art, thinking about the way that markets and states both present themselves as solutions to climate change through the mechanisms that they propose, I thought rather than continuing the project by working again with sort of looking at emissions trading markets, I would look then at the sort of question of intergovernmental processes. And because at that time the COP process was in this situation, I thought, well, what organizations also sort of make claims to look after natural and cultural heritage? And I thought, well, it might be interesting to think about whether or not Earth's atmosphere might be submitted for inscription on the UNESCO World Heritage List, since all sites that are already on the World Heritage List, well, will be impacted by climate change if they're not already. So in order to do that, what I did first was I wrote a list to Francesca Francioni, and I said I was interested in making a tentative list submission. However, I wasn't a state party, and I also wasn't sure how it qualified as what was called a property. He answered me somewhat positively, which I was surprised by, and said that it might be worthwhile to begin a nomination process, although all nations must be included. So I began tentative list submission. Property Earth's atmosphere, where is it? The atmosphere is part of the Earth's general environment. Description, all life on Earth depends on the protection of the atmosphere, a uniquely singular dynamic system from anthropogenic pollution, and sort of what criteria did it have for outstanding universal value. It checked many of them. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to move ahead with that at that point. So I went back and began to look at emissions markets and explore those over the European Union, and was able to reopen the park with the purchase of the right to emit 51 tons of carbon dioxide over Europe. And I worked with an atmospheric chemist to sort of figure out how large that would be. And sorry about that. And that would be about the size of 51 football stadiums. Or if you wanted to look at it a different way, a 205 by 205 meter wide column stretching from the Earth to the edge of space. The other thing that was really interesting is that, and just because of time, I'm not going to go into it, there's been this series of ongoing desires to set a carbon price. And as I was making these purchases, that price was collapsing. So as the right to purchase, as the offsets became cheaper, the park got bigger. And also, too, I was looking at like 5 to 7 euros a ton, as opposed to looking at $4 a pound for NOx. So this sort of question about valuation of whether or not you're calling them pollutants or they're greenhouse gases, depending on the specifics. It's very interesting to me to see this kind of way that a commodity is produced, and also about that process, how it looks. The other thing that I did in 2006, when we were able to open the park, and when I say we, myself and the students who worked with me, the traders in Eastern Europe who made this trade for me to help open the park, we also did a climate featuring breakfast held the morning of the first mass climate change march, offering coffee, cat, bagels, and a dialogue with climate scientists and activists, and an invitation to march after the event. The reason that we had coffee and also khat is because they're sort of two social stimulants from two different cultural contexts, both of which are sort of used to essentially chew the fat, and produce a kind of public sphere. And it's actually very interesting thinking about the history of coffee and thinking about the more recent history of khat, which I'm mispronouncing, in terms of different public spheres and those dialogues in relationship to climate change, and also the impacts of the particular users' publics. In April 2010, I was able to open the park again over the United States, again through markets, because there was a collapse here of a regulated market. So I was able to purchase the right to emit 500 tons, and that was, I think, 25 cents a ton. Because I purchased them from the Chicago Climate Exchange, or the CCX, which was collapsing, and I was able to make that purchase, but it didn't last long. So I think I'm at about 20 minutes now, 22 minutes. I'm going to go a few more minutes on this, and then I'm going to come to the last project. In 2012, I renewed attempts to inscribe Earth's atmosphere on the World Heritage List, began with a letter written on, I was working with Documenta 13's curator to Germany, seeking their role as a lead state party. And I took up the invitation to do this through Documenta because I was thinking about state soft power, and perhaps I might be able to utilize that. In retrospect, it's quite complex, especially thinking about VW, the VW emissions scandal, VW as one of the major underwriters of Documenta, and thinking about what does it mean for projects like this to get bound up in state dynamics, power dynamics, funding dynamics. In order to do this, I wrote the statement that the German state could use if they were willing to go forward with the process. That was rejected. So that invitation was then extended to all UNESCO states parties. 186 letters were sent out, 13 replies came back. This letter from the ambassador of Switzerland basically said that they thought it was an unproductive process. However, the Kingdom of Tonga was interested but lacked the resources to initiate and lead a nomination process. So very quickly, this is how it was documented. Here are the outgoing letters, here are the responses, and then that was turned over to a public petition. 90,000 people participated in the petition. These were all sent to the replacement minister, who again said no. I've gone back to Australia, who have also since said no, and a state party is still sought. So in the meantime, when public smog is open, how can I have an event there? And I would say by breathing or other self-directed activities. How can public smog remain open to the public? And I would say through use action. And how can I public smog? And I would argue by any means necessary. Now this leaves me maybe 2 to 5 minutes to go with another project, and quickly, just a few images as an interstitial. While I was working on public smog, I was invited to open it up over Africa, as there was a chance that markets were going to begin there. That didn't happen at the time, so instead I was able to work and do this public billboard project in Douala, Cameroon, which prefigures a public park opening there. I'm just going to show you 4 images. And it's in English and French, which are 2 major advertising languages there. So finally, that brings me to a People's Archive of Sinking and Melting, which is a growing collection of items contributed by people from places that may already disappear, becoming uninhabitable in a range of time scales, which is, up to the participant, owing to the combined physical, political, and economic impacts of climate change. Through what I call common but differentiated collections, contributed materials form an archive of the future anterior, or what will have been. I'm just going to quickly show you some images, and then I'll conclude. The materials contributed to the archive mark the asymmetry of present or anticipated loss or slow onset dispossession. Together, the contributions form one material record among many, a collection of community-gathered evidence, and a public record. The archive operates from the principle that anything is equally valuable as a record of present or projected future disappearance of a place as chosen from someone there. It doesn't have to originate from that location. It could be anything that happens to be there, including detritus, flotsam, or jetsam. I'm just going to quickly show you some images. This is the New Orleans collection. All items were found by Pleasurine Thomas, Monique Dean, Taiwanese McKenzie, Wynell Davis, LaShine Dickerson, and Melissa Orzalek in the Upper Ninth Ward of New Orleans. They answered some questions about their contribution, which they made in 2012. Do you live where the object came from? These are kids who contributed. Some kids do, others have moved. They all have family in the neighborhood. What have you seen disappear, environmentally or otherwise? Houses and businesses? Why did you contribute to the archive so people know what happened after the storm came? And that would be Katrina. This is walls and ceilings, a metal washer, rocks, a broken phone charger, plastic bag found in an abandoned church, shells, common in the soil of New Orleans, peanut shells, blue string, a slipper, Mama instant noodles packaging, plastic fork and knife, broken beer bottle bottom, bicycle chain ring, rusty metal dowel, bottle cap. This is the Antarctica Collection. All items were contributed by Michaela Noyce, with Nandor Kovacs, Bill Burns, and Steve Sweet. Do you live where the objects came from? No one lives in Antarctica, but many people work there for months or even a year or 2 at a time. I went, as most people do, in the role of a worker who provides labor and logistical support for scientific research teams. This is the Cape Verde collection. It's one item. Contributed by Nanashinho and Yelena Adeli from Salray, Boa Vista. She says, when I ask, what have you seen disappear there? Environmentally or otherwise, what do these disappearances mean? Water shortages and coastal erosion are the main consequences of climate change in Cape Verde. Among fishermen, there is a strong perception that fish resources have been greatly reduced. Rains are stronger, but also less. Disappearances have different meanings. Cape Verdean fishermen and farmers associate the disappearance of fish or rain, often with spiritual or religious causes, as an ending or transformation of the world. To conclude, some issues that have come up for the archive are questions of representation. Who has the capacity to participate, and thus where, what, and who is represented, and the relative stakes of disappearance of the locations represented? For example, Venice, Italy is represented, yet the Italian state has the adaptive capacity to fund the Moe's tidal project seawall to protect the lagoon. Additionally, only one presentation of the archive in Cuba has taken place out of what's called an Annex I country. For this reason, among others, the archive utilizes the UNFCCC Climate Negotiation Annex Party designations on item labels for the archive. This is to help viewers better understand the items and locate them politically, and to help the audience attend to the potentially changing status of the UNFCCC process as it influences whether or not these losses are more or less likely to occur if situated in the future. The archive also uses the terminology of common but differentiated collections, taking, again, from the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change phrasing of common but differentiated responsibility of parties, in such that Annex I countries must lead in combating climate change, since they have most contributed to and most benefited from the emission of carbon and greenhouse gases. And I'll just close to say that when I initiated the archive, 2 community archives struck me. One of these was the People's Archive, the People's Museum in Bizrait, Palestine, self-described as a bottom-up museum made up of local contributions chosen through dialogue between local residents, organizations, art students, and others, and the Denora Smog Museum in Pennsylvania, which is a storefront museum housing a collection of materials documenting the deadly 1948 inversion smog that trapped air pollution from U.S. Steel zinc works and American Steel and Wire, sickening and killing residents there. The aftermath of that disaster sparked the Clean Air movement in the United States and led to the first Air Pollution Control Act of 1955. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Very cool. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. That was wonderful. I'm very pleased to introduce Steve Kurtz, co-founder of the tactical media collective Critical Art Ensemble, which has created an extraordinary body of politically engaged work in digital media, installation, film, video, photography, book arts, and performance since its formation in 1987. Much of the group's activity has focused on social and environmental justice and civil disobedience in the face of corporate and government power, often using technology to foster public knowledge and participation. Steve and his colleagues have been invited to exhibit and/or perform at many prominent museums and galleries around the world, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, the Corcoran Art Gallery, the Institute for Contemporary Art in London, Documenta 13, and many others, as well as a lot of non-institutional sites. Critical Art Ensemble has also received many grants and awards, including the Andy Warhol Foundation Win Komarski Freedom of Artistic Expression Grant, the John Lansdowne Award for Multimedia, and the Leonardo New Horizons Award. Steve and his colleagues have often operated creatively outside standard institutional frameworks, using experimental techniques and citizen science that official authorities sometimes find it difficult to understand. In 2004, Steve was arrested by police in Buffalo, New York, and detained by the FBI on unwarranted suspicions of bioterrorism. Responding to a family emergency at his home, police found petri dishes and biological specimens that Steve was using to prepare an art installation on GMO agriculture for the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. Federal agents in hazmat suits raided his residence and took possession of computers, books, legal lab equipment, and art materials, while leaving behind piles of their own trash, including numerous pizza boxes and plastic bags. The New York Health Department determined there was no threat to public health or safety from his artistic experiments, but Steve and his associates endured years of scrutiny and legal hassles before all charges were dropped. These events were dramatized in the 2000 film Strange Culture, directed by Lynn Hirschman Leeson. Recent work by Critical Art Ensemble has emphasized ecology, environmental justice, public knowledge, and local memory as alternatives to the homogenizing imperial effects of unregulated capitalism. Please welcome Steve Kurtz.
All right, I'll let you set that up.
Yes, yes.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And yeah, so I'm here representing Critical Art Ensemble today, and just for those of you that aren't familiar with us, we kind of envision ourselves as an experimental wing for progressive and activist causes. We try to develop liberated territories, tactics and tools for resistant purposes, and of course, the manipulation of signs and symbols in order to generate new ideas and possibilities in terms of what the social sphere can be. So today I'm going to show a few projects and perhaps get involved in ones that's specifically related to environmental justice, something that we do have a great deal of interest in. And the first one is Peep Under the Elbow from 2008 that we did in Hamburg. I'd been to Hamburg a lot of times, and it was a very strange city to me because while there were lots of working people and doing these very poor service jobs, I could never figure out where they lived, right? That there was this giant immigrant community, 31 different ethnicities, and again, I could never figure out where they lived. Well, we were invited to the Culture Nature Festival to do a project, and they said, come to Hamburg, and we're like, oh, it's going to be another fun trip to St. Pauli. We'll be drinking beer all summer and then doing some environmental work. Well, as it turned out, where they located this particular festival was in Wilhelmsburg. And for those of you that don't know Wilhelmsburg, even if you've been to Hamburg, it's not surprising because it is hidden in the island in the center of the Elbe. So what you normally see is, of course, the port of Hamburg, which is, is huge. And you kind of think like, okay, well, that's what's over there on the island. But no, on the inner working of the island is massive public housing and projects. And when you wonder where all those working poor are, where all the immigrants are, that's where they are, right? Very little infrastructure, it's hard to get into, it's hard to get out of, but most importantly, it's invisible. That's the way it was designed. This is one of the canals that you can kind of get the hang of how it is kept invisible by all of the port buildings. And so when we got there and started looking around, it was somewhat of a shock because if you were just to drive through, you'd say, well, it's not so bad. I mean, there's pretty reasonable green spaces and there are parks. It's nothing like when you see public housing in the US or in the UK and you go, this is unbelievably horrible. However, once you're there for a little bit, the situation changes rather rapidly because you find out that this entire island is basically a toxic dump. And on top of that, there is a fat rendering factory right in the center of it that makes sure the entire island really smells bad. And by smelling bad, I mean, you would say, if only I could have a sewage treatment plant here instead. That's the level I'm talking about. So we start looking at the water, which many people are using as a resource, both recreationally and some are using it for food, they're fishing in it. And this just seemed like a bad idea. I mean, just the colorations of the various water, particularly on the interior, where it was really blue from when there was a giant copper factory there. This particular canal, which was one of the more popular swimming canals, is full of arsenic that's leaching out of the paint that's coming off the ships that dock there. So what do? And on this journey we're about to go on, I'm going to go from kind of the hopeless to glimmer of hope. Maybe that's the continuum we're going to be on right now. What do you do in this situation? Where you can't go and say, folks who live here, you really shouldn't be eating the fish out of this water, and you probably should definitely not be swimming in it, when it is kind of what they view as their recreational assets. It's what's available to them. It's in many ways what makes life better. So how do you go and say, that thing you like so much? Well, you need to not do that. We never really figured it out, but this is what we did. We went and tested as much of the water as we could. of the different canals, found where all the really hot spots were, just like this canal that was popular for swimming. So we did the test. We then sent out the water samples to various labs in Europe and in North America to make sure we had reasonable reliability on it, which we did. The results were fairly consistent. Bad. And we went to the main water bureaucracy that was in charge of managing all of the canals and river and creeks, and asked them about it and said, hey, we've been looking at your water here and it's terrible. And they said, we know it's terrible, but you know what's even worse? The silt underneath it. It's really terrible. And they proceeded to get out documents showing us that the silt was a complete red line. They were charting it on a numerical basis that ranged between 1 and 8. And the silt in these canals were 8+, meaning they couldn't really even measure the toxicity anymore. So we said, is there any possible way to clean this up? And the reply was, well, probably not, because their estimate, and I think this is a little high, but if it's even in the ballpark, you can see why nothing's going to ever be done. They were saying it was going to cost 100,000 euros per square meter to remediate these canals. So it's like, okay, that's not happening. Thank you for being so open and honest, because they said, you know, the little money that we do have, that's going to stay in Hamburg proper. It's not going over to the disaster zone. And just to give you a little background of why it was a disaster zone, that goes back to when there was still the DDR. And the DDR did not really care about the environment. That was not on their mind at all. They were very big on chemical fertilizers, and they did nothing about runoff. So all of those fertilizers would wash down the Elbe, and Wilhelmsburg, the island, would act as kind of a giant filter for the river and just collected it all. And there it is to this very day. So, you know, we went around to all the fishermen and people who were having their picnics by the river and whatever else, and just basically talked to them about what was going on with that water, which no one had ever really done. And people got to know us, because, you know, here are these crazy Americans riding bikes up and down all of the canals, stopping and doing water tests with people, and trying to get them to see what was going. So there was the copper testing, which was almost always off the charts. So that there are so much heavy metals in the water, which wasn't the worst of it. Sometimes it was just the bacterial level. And then we just went to all of the beaches, popular fishing spots, and we made maps that really showed the super hot spots that if you're going to swim there, just at least don't put your head underwater. You know, that was really all we could do. We put them in all the community centers, anywhere that we could kind of spread the information around, but there was no way to really intervene in a kind of productive way. And, you know, this is kind of like one of the problems I'm throwing out here of what do we do in these situations? What do we do in the face of just overwhelming disaster and toxicity, right? While at the same time trying to balance out a quality of life issues for the people that are there and kind of stuck there. You know, how do we balance these two things? It's this huge question of environmental justice for it. When you know the equity's not ever coming, right? The Lone Ranger is not going to show up. So then what do we do? All right, so that's kind of question one I'd like to throw on the table. This is New Alliances. And New Alliances was how can landscape, non-human, and human actors all work to mutual benefit? What kind of situation could we envision where that could happen? This was one that we came up with a pretty good solution, I think, but a lot of planets have to line up for this to function right. And what we thought we could do was we could take an endangered or threatened species of plant and use that as a means to protect endangered green and open spaces, community gardens in urban areas. All right, because they have legal protection, and that's one of the things that has to happen. So you've got to have that. First, you have to have the legal protection laws. You have to find the right species of plant, and it has to be domesticated, right? Because you can't go out in the wild and take the seeds of a threatened plant and go, it's for good purpose. I'm borrowing these. That's going to get you in a lot of trouble. And you probably just, on an ethical basis, shouldn't do it. But in this particular case, the planets did line up, right? It's in Piedmont region of Italy, so there's a great deal of law for the protection of a lot of rare species that are there. And one of them was Cupid's dart, which is what we chose, which is a very nice mountain flower, very beautiful. Well, here's the other planet that has the lineup that we didn't know at the time. We thought we were going to go over there, couple of weeks, grow some of these plants, stick them in the ground where we thought needed protection at the community garden or at the squat or whatever else. And that would be that, you know, and you could send out the press releases whenever the territories were endangered, right? We could use this as what we were thinking of it as a deferral tactic. You can't do that, as it turns out. Our friend here, one of the farmers, local farmers who was helping us oversee the project, informed us that, well, yeah, you can grow it in a greenhouse, but as soon as you transplant that plant into the wild, it's going to die. You've really got to give it a year in outdoor elements for it to adjust, and then you can plant it, and it will probably live. So you're telling me my project's actually going to be a year long? Yes. That's what the word was. All right. So we're going to put in for a year. We can't use greenhouses or anything like that. We have to try to simulate best we can wild conditions for 1 year before transplanting them into the green spaces that we were hoping to move into. Yeah, it actually happened. We had enough volunteers and enough people working with us and a lot of people that were quite concerned about it to do it. Now, what do you get for all of that action? Well, you get deferment, because one of the problems that probably many of you have all run into is that with these urban spaces, developers like the tactic of surprise, of where you think your space is safe, and then all of a sudden one day it's like, it's not safe anymore. We're coming and the development's going to start in a month. It's a done deal. We just got to get one more signature at the community council, and that will be that. Right? So this was a way that we had a kind of tactical weapon to defer that. That we could go and say, well, you can't start developing there because there's endangered species on that land. Right? Now, what's going to eventually happen? Same as here in the US, it'll happen in Italy too. The folks with the most money win. And that means, like I said, it's only a delaying tactic. It's not something that's going to last. But you get two things out of it. One, the deferral, so you can kind of reorganize your troops to maybe think of a way to get enough community pressure up to stop the development. That's one thing you get. But if you lose that battle, you get the second thing, and that is you get the video bulldozers coming and running over endangered species. And that's like publicity no company wants. So you get it's kind of like going down swinging. At the very least, you get that much. Okay, this is back to your introduction. This is what put us on the FBI's radar, was doing this project, was molecular invasion. And we did it at the Corcoran. Sometimes museums can be really handy, and that's in terms of their legitimacy, and it can kind of give an umbrella of protection that you definitely don't get when you're just kind of out in the fields, like with New Alliances or Peep Under the Elba. Right, you get a kind of legitimacy and shield. And for this project, we need it because it was, an out-and-out provocation that we wanted to bring a lot of publicity to. So what were we doing? We wanted to start what we believed was a contestational biology. That is, how do we take the processes and knowledge systems of molecular biology and make them work for environmentalist causes? And we thought we could do it. You know, this was where we could do a kind of proof of concept, was in this museum, where we would get really good coverage. And we could hopefully pass the idea on to citizen scientists that would probably be able to do it a lot better than we could. So in this particular project, what we wanted to do was to find a way to target Monsanto's Roundup Ready crops. Right, because this is, you know, another one of these horrible travesties of environmental justice again. Right? Monsanto at the time that we were doing this was basically suing farmers for patent infringement when pollen from neighboring fields would blow into organic farmers' fields or traditional farmer fields, contaminate their crops. You would think it'd be the other way, wouldn't you? Contaminate their crops, ruin their seed banks, and then on top of it, they get sued. So we thought about that, and it was like, all right, two things here. One, if stuff's just blowing around, and you know, wherever it lands, it's like too bad, buyer beware, kind of. Well, we can use that. So we can use the wind as a delivery system. And then the second thing we realized is that anything in the biological world, just like in the social world, can be flipped. And in this case, the trait of adaptability that made these plants able to resist Roundup Ready herbicide could be changed into a trait of susceptibility. That we could attack that gene that gave it that ability to protect itself from the herbicide. And that would not hurt any other plant but those plants, because no other plant has bacteria genes in them. So we found a way, at least we thought we had a method to do some serious targeting. Now, the question is, what would that substance be that would kill this plant, that would change that gene into a trait of susceptibility? Well, we had no idea. But we did know how to do research. And what we again found out in that particular case was that when Monsanto patented this product, calling plants a product, they had to publish all of their experimentation. That all became public domain. And so we could look into their records and see what they were thinking would hurt the plant. And they thought of a lot of stuff. Now, most of it was pretty horrible, and you couldn't use it because it was just too toxic. But we found one thing, pyridoxal 5-phosphate, a vitamin B compound, that seemed to do the job. That if you had that on the plants, and it was sunny, you had light, and then they sprayed it with Roundup, it would kill the plant. I was like, thank you, Monsanto. And so this is what we did. We did a public experiment there at the Corcoran saying we are going to find a way to do this flip, that farmers should be able to build defense kits out of this research to protect themselves from neighboring plants. Because if this stuff just happens to blow in the air over to Monsanto's crops, not our fault, just the wind carrying it. Needless to say, Monsanto was not amused with this. And before we knew it, the gallery was filled with lawyers with cease and desist notices and threatening to sue us. And they did, like I said, this is when they did turn us into the FBI for terrorism. Yeah. So what became of all of that was they really couldn't do anything because Monsanto has the worst public relations record ever. And, you know, if corporations really were people, they should be tried and put in jail, if not executed, right? I mean, they were really we're at that kind of level. So there wasn't much you can do, and it's very hard to justify suing the Corcoran, right? The other exhibition that was on at the same time that we were doing our exhibition was Jackie Onassis's ball gowns. So it's hard to pull the rug out from under that. Anyway, so that's what went on. We're still trying to work with that. Contestational biology has been a much tougher climb than earlier work we did with digital technology and developing means of civil disobedience through digital structures. And that's because, you know, this kind of science work, it's just very alien to most people's everyday life, unlike computers, which we all have, you know, in a ubiquitous way. I've got like 3 screens here right now. So, we're hoping for the best, because there is so much that can be done using scientific method to augment traditional activism. It's really quite amazing what we can do as we enter deeper and deeper into the artificial kingdom. And speaking of the artificial kingdom, the kingdom of soy. Anybody have an idea where this is? There's no wrong answer. Sure, Iowa. Anyone else want to throw one out? It could be, yeah, it could be Iowa, it could be China, it could be India. In this case, it happens to be Argentina. But it could be anywhere, right? This is, you know, to use the Guattarian concept, this is deterritorialization, capitalist deterritorialization of the worst order, right? Where it has just been totally, the land has been totally stripped and ransacked and scraped of any of its cultural, social, and political value. It's all gone. And environmentally speaking, it's basically dead too. Right? All that's there is Monsanto chemical, and it's not just Monsanto, they're all there, DuPont and Cargill. It's a big bonanza of a huge land grab, and that they've monocropped the whole thing. And everything's gone. If you had gone there 50 years ago, there would be peasant farms, and there would be cattle ranches, and it would be a completely different ecology. But now, it's just this. You know, dotted with truck depots to move the product around, and these huge processing plants. And I mean, they are monstrous. Sorry that it's, you know, they're so far away, but if you get any closer, you know, there's basically a mercenary army that comes out to meet you. They're not screwing around there. And it's something you're going to do, that a lot of this type of activism, if you're really working your way and working their nerves, you're going to meet people that are very unpleasant, and they're probably going to be armed, and they're probably not going to be adverse to violence. So you've got to be willing to put your body on the line a little bit for a lot of this work. Okay, I know I said I was going to take you somewhere good, and I'm sure most of you are going, Steve, this is horrible. You know, this is what you're ending on, this horribleness? No, I'm going to end on something pretty good. Because why we were there was not just to see the devastation, but also to work with this very large coalition of scientists, artists, biologists, farmers, et cetera, that are trying to figure out a new model for farming in Argentina. Is how could you do 25-hectare farms and have them be profitable and at the same time be able to sustain a family and perhaps 2 that could live on it, so that all the people that have been dispossessed and put into the favelas could come back to the land again. And it's all done organically. Everything is grown by crop placement, so there's no need for any chemical fertilizer. There's no need for pesticides. You know, he would always say, you can see kind of little dots on the fruit. He would say that the farmer, one of the farmers there would say, I love those dots. It just shows that my fruit is organic, that I'm not putting anything on it. Those are little birds have bit it. And so, it's everything. It's meat, it's herbs, it's vegetables, it's fruit, so that it can sustain a person also on a healthy diet. But then there's also a matter of value added for when they sell it. So they take the fruit and they make jams. They butcher their own meat and sell the meat butchered instead of on the hoof. And all of this increases the profit margin. They grow wheat. I mean, this is one of the things the Kingdom of Soy has done, is it's caused wheat shortages. They eat a lot of bread down in Argentina, and this makes for some real problems, right? Because all the land's on soy and there's no one growing wheat. So they grow wheat, they make it into flour themselves. And what this leads to is, to my mind, an actual plausible infrastructure for real land reform. There is still in Argentina, I think, enough people who are still Peronists in a way, at least in the sense that they believe the colonists can be expelled. It's been done once, it can be done again. And that they believe if they have this infrastructure, this idea for a viable infrastructure built, and that they can get enough of the people to rise up for land reform, that they can kick these corporations out again and redistribute that land. I don't know if it's going to happen. They're patient. They're looking at this on a very long-term basis. But at least it's plausible. It's an actual strategic action that could have a redistributive end, right? Quite the opposite of where I started. That's actually plausible, which is why we were so excited to be involved in it. Whether it'll happen, I don't know. So I leave you all today then with this quote to conclude from Gramsci: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve, very, very much. I'm going to bring up the house lights and ask Ravi and Amy and Steve to come up front here and join Rob Nixon, who will entertain your questions and guide discussion. As many of you know, Rob Nixon is the Curry C. and Thomas A. Barron Family Professor in the Humanities and the Environment here at Princeton, the author of many books, including the multiple award-winning Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor.
Great. It's a great honor to be here, and thanks so much, Alan, for making this possible. 3 terrific presentations, a lot of resonances among them. We have about 20-something minutes for discussion, and what I thought would be most productive, both in terms of involving as many audience members as possible and involving the panel collectively, is to take 3 questions at a time. These can either be for the panel in general or for individual presenters. And then I'll just turn those over to the presenters, and they can pass on a question or engage more with one particular question. So the idea is not to have essayistic questions, but fairly precise questions that will allow for a maximum engagement on the part of these remarkable artists. So, yeah, any responses, questions?
How do you bridge the gap that the first speaker mentioned on between the point of view and the conditioned attitudes of the farmers, fishermen, and people who are living in these environments, and introducing change there, as well as modifying the point of view of the developers? It seems to me there's a big space here in perceptions of what this land or water is used for, or what it's really all about.
Okay, thank you so much. Anybody else?
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question regarding going to compare the last two presentations regarding the costs of death. It seems that in the last presentation, it seemed that like death is caused, or toxicity is caused because of negligence, but it's a very, very cheap to throw waste in water. Well, in the second presentation, it seems to me that death of minorities is actually very expensive if we put in a qualitative notion of smog, right? So I guess my question is just trying to think through the cost of death with maybe trying to think of that not so much as or toxicity as something that an easy waste site, but instead as something that is very expensive. That was my other opinion.
One more? Yeah, thank you.
I guess I'm curious about the role of science here, and particularly the ambivalence of science. In the case of GMOs and I all of a sudden feel like I'm on a karaoke stage, but no. With the role of like science in the case of the GMOs, I mean, historically science has been sort of seen as on the side of capital and like the mega pharmaceutical, agricultural, chemical complex kind of thing. Whereas in the case of climate change, of course, science is seen more of an ally to the environmental movements. So there's a sort of ambiguous status, I guess, that comes out in your presentations, where in some cases science is very much, on the side of environmental justice. In other cases, particularly the soy kingdom kind of stuff, it's not. So I'm just wondering how each of you sort of deals with that.
Right, terrific. So we have a question, two questions on perception, the relationship between the perception of those who live in the area versus shifting the perception of the developers. The perception of science in relation to, say, climate change versus Monsanto. And then the question of the costs of death in relation to minority communities. So if any of you like to pick up on any of those, all pretty large questions.
Well, I'll start with the science one because that's of concern. And a lot of that is just, it's solved through context. Because there's great citizen science organizations that are out there and that are working hard and that are trying to speak the truth in terms of something like climate change. Then there are the corporate scientists, and of course, they're paid to come to certain conclusions in advance. So when you're dealing with them, it's not too good. But then there's the biggest category, I think, are the indifferent scientists. That it's not my it's not my problem. You give me a problem to solve and I solve it. What happens when you make policy around it or when it goes out into the social sphere? Not my problem. That's for citizens and politicians and whatever else to work out. And as much as I hate to say it, the universities are quite guilty of pushing that particular position. I mean, particularly at the science schools, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Caltech. I mean, they don't think about it. And the students are encouraged not to think about what they're doing. You just solve the problem. That's really the most dangerous category because they're out there and they're just developing what they're developing. The science goes where it goes. And that's primarily how we get things like atom bombs. Just not my problem. That's the military's problem.
I would like to quickly take on your question, just because I think it's provocative and opens up some interesting questions for me. And I think, first of all, you have the question of reform versus revolution, right? If you talk about a kind of the question of accounting or accounting of all life, right? Regardless of what life that is. you know, I think there was a quote in your book, and I can't remember it, about the question of like under pollution.
Oh, yeah.
Do you recall that?
Yeah, about exporting pollution from LA to Africa.
Yeah, and that it was underpolluted. You know,
Right, it was underpolluted.
so I think there's this question about pollution or underpollution or what lives have value. You know, and I think the question is, you know, that it's certainly a dismal accounting, and so I think, you know, it's also interesting to think of in terms of the rhetoric. Also, when you start thinking about ecosystem services, right? And this question about the valuation of all nature, you know, versus another kind of attitude, which is the position of Mother Earth, right? But then I think the question is, under capitalism, you know, there also have been pushbacks. Well, if within capitalism, if you just look at this kind of question of intrinsic versus extrinsic, and you don't make an accounting for all of life, then ultimately all of life is seen as having no value, you know, and will be more excavated. And I think that there's an interesting question about like carbon in living forests, you know, and how that's applied to that, as well as to maybe the carbon in living bodies. How would you value the carbon in a political march? What kind of valuation is there in a kind of different bodies that are resisting, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, I think that that's a quite open response, and I would love to, you know, just very quickly before I finish that very open thought, what prompted your question, or what's your background that brings you into that question?
Well, my main interests are environmental racism in the U.S., specifically minority communities.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very interested in how you could commodify smog, and something that is so present in the literature of, for example, Latino or African American.
Right. And I think, I mean, if you wanted to do it, right, it would be an interesting thing in terms of like what would be the biopolitical value of that, and I would wonder about looking at. I mean, there would be interesting people you could collaborate with if you wanted to make a political argument from that analysis. I mean, I would wonder what. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I hope I didn't take it in maybe the wrong direction there. But I think that there's so many of these questions that you can get a grip on from various perspectives. Yeah.
Just to add in, I'm sorry, go ahead.
After you.
And we'll just add in very quickly to something that CAE is really interested right now, is the question of necropolitics. And
right.
we have no language to talk about death except as atrocity, right? And it is just a painful wound in the environmentalist movement, because such stupid things are said because there's no language to articulate ourselves. So you get something like Edward R. Wilson saying, you know what would be great is if we could leave half the earth to lie fallow. Well, great suggestion. It will do a lot for biodiversity, I know. But tell me what that's going to mean in terms of what's going to happen to all the people while you're doing this, right? Or, you know, or the radical Greens, you know, that discuss, almost basically put on the table what we need to do is annihilate humans. Yeah, that's going to get people on the environmentalist bandwagon. And they don't put it that way. They just leave that as this vague thing. But what they're suggesting, since it leaves out any conception of that, is either absurd or ruinous, and doesn't really help in terms of solution.
I think the question about the gap, about the conversation, well, technically there should be no gap in representational democracies. It's supposed to be, the conversation should be alive and ongoing, but that's not the way it really takes place, because firstly, it's a sliding scale. It does this idea of disaster only as a crisis. It's not the way it really happens on the ground. So there is no real crisis which is perceived. It just happens step by step. And secondly, also people see different benefits in participating in the change, rather till it becomes too late to participate in it anymore. So they see the little small benefits. It breaks the idea of coming together for something. And there is no community of resistance which forms. There's really individual scoping with the change. So what should have been a conversation? And thirdly, when these developers, for example, a port is being made, you know, a port is made 50 miles away, it's going to dramatically change your beach. The way the port is evaluated, the way what is valued in that evaluation has very little to do with what really happens on the ground there. And there is an understanding in the factors which cause the change. So it's not as if all the ecological causalities are neatly marked out. It's a very reduced science of environmental assessments which really make the decision possible. And I think it brings to the fore that how do we value this, for example, the idea of valuation and the TEEB report kind of thing, how do you value what, even ecosystem services, do we even understand the factors, the micro factors which are taking place? We don't understand those factors. So, and at the subjective level, so if this is the objective idea, at the subjective level, if the conversation is missing, or the way in which perceptions are bought in, so if I perceive the beach as disappearing, how do I measure that disappearance? So there's always this constant, many kinds of alienations which take place, and the processes slide in, and that's the way it's been happening.
Alan.
All of you have done really interesting work interacting with communities that are affected by environmental injustice. And I'm just wondering, kind of piggybacking on the question about science, how do people respond when you refer to yourself as an artist? Is that an entree? Is it a way of gaining access? Does it help? Or is it a problem? I'm wondering about the sort of, how does being an artist play with the communities that you're interacting with?
Okay, great. Thanks. More questions? Anybody else?
Thanks again for your amazing presentations. Just maybe to follow up a little bit on that and to return to Amy's point from earlier, how do you negotiate the role of being an artist and being, I mean, I think this is a question for all of us, is like, how do we negotiate the role of both having to operate within capitalist structures that are kind of undermining the project that you're actually doing, if that makes sense?
Yeah, thanks. Okay. So we have how you perceive in the community when you present yourself as an artist, and this question which relates to the ecosystem services discussion we've been having of how do you work as an artist against the value system of capitalism, but also in some sense may be internal to it or complicit in it. And I just wanted to sneak in a third question, if I may, which was, Ravi, in your presentation, I found fascinating this a dimension that's really in all three of the presentations around the shifts in scale from particulate to abstract. And I mean, it's something that both politically and imaginatively we're all grappling with. And you mentioned that the absence of the word nature in your conversations with the Tamil fishing community. But next to the word crabs, it was the word climate change. And I wondered if you might elaborate on how that came up in relation to what seemed like very textured particularities in the other words that you selected. So let's engage with those three questions and take it from there.
Do
you want to respond to that question?
I respond to the first two, and then I come to yours. Well, in a flippant sort of way, when I participated in the Artist as Witness project, and the judge said, "Oh, you're an artist, I thought you should be dressed more colorfully than what you are." So this belief that artists are somehow not normal human beings and come from the outside is very prevalent. In the community, I don't present myself as anybody. I am what I am. I'm doing also. So it's really an honest. And because if you come to the community as an artist, then you're treated like you can always walk out, and you're treated like you'll take something and go away. And I remember, I mean, there are several instances of that. When Arundhati Roy worked with the Narmada movement, she was, then she left at some point, and she said, I'm a writer. So as a writer, I can participate when I want, and I can leave when I want, in a sense. So this thing of being a participant but being an observer, it's not an easy space to negotiate. And I think there has to be some honesty of purpose in that, why you're there, and it has to be stated. When I was doing Down and Out, I was often asked by the workers, so what will you do with our pictures? And I said, I'll tell you a story. He said, how will the story help us? I said, I don't know if your story will help you, but if you want to be part of the story, then allow me in. So there is no easy negotiation to that. You're also representing something, and that's always a complex place to be. And I think you just bring yourself to that. And about climate change, the climate change has become such a big bogey that's mentioned. So NGOs come and talk to them about it, that it's told to them in various meetings. So that something is happening which is bigger than them. It's become part of their imagination of things. It's abstracted, but then it becomes part of everything. So everything becomes climate change in a sense. You know, it's hard to say what is climate change and what is normal change, or what is abnormal normal change, or normal abnormal change.
Well, yeah, let's continue with the first three. Yeah. Okay.
When I started Invisible 5, I proposed it, and I had already studied in graduate school environmental justice. And Bradley Angel came into the course I was taking, and I was really impressed by his work and wanted to collaborate. And I had learned in my class, you know, these sort of questions about what does it mean when you go into communities that are already beleaguered and would like something from them or would like to do something. And so, and what I had understood from our conversation is that, you know, there are questions about what you can offer the community, understanding a kind of past, especially in the Bay Area where there are lots of research universities, and there's often this extraction of knowledge or extraction of information from communities, and people don't necessarily want to participate because of that history. So when I made my case to make an argument for collaboration, I took on particular aspects of the work. I asked him to introduce me to people and I also think too, there's this question about many of the people who participated in Invisible 5 were people who had become activists or radicalized because of their own political experience, and many of them were already people who were outspoken. So, in one hand, I think as an artist, I came in sort of saying, well, here's what I can offer. You know, if you want to participate, here's what I can lay out. And in terms of like what I could offer the community or not, in some ways, what we had hoped to do was to take things that have often been in the media, but in local news media, but network them together along the string of the freeway and try to create a kind of remapping of the kind of reciprocity of community support that had been offered in terms of how communities in California and across the West have come together in mutual support. And I'm not saying we presented that, but many people were interested. You know, we paid people. There was a good amount of money that went to Green Action, and we took upon ourselves as collaborators certain amounts of labor so as not to take away from the activism time of the organization. So that was for me one example of how we came into that. And some people said no, they didn't want to be a part of the project, and that was understandable. As an artist coming into other contexts, I've presented public smog in climate change conferences. And for example, I had a chance to meet one of the Bangladeshi Minister of Forestry, and you know, I'm very heartened by the work that they have done on loss and dispossession. And I was so happy to introduce myself, and I didn't really have anything to offer him, so I think there was he had a limited amount of interest in me as an artist, and I think there's a question about the way those politics play at different levels.
Well, I'm going to go in another direction. This is a battle I've been fighting for years, and it's not going to be popular in here, I'm pretty sure. But first off, perhaps in Ravi's case, this does not apply in small rural communities. There, I think you can say community. But in the grand majority of cases that, at least that I find myself in, particularly in urban areas, to call anything a community is absolute nonsense. It's just nonsense. It doesn't describe anything. What it describes is an affect. It describes a sympathy, an empathy. That's really what that term is. In terms of a social constellation, it's meaningless and probably dangerous, because a community in a real sense is based on the principles of sameness and homogenization, right? And most of what I'm having to deal with is about difference and inclusion, not exclusion, right? So if you're in an urban area on a block that's dense and got 10,000 people in it, these people do not all have the same interests. Even if they're the same color or same ethnic background, there's amazing diversity in their interests. And so, to say that I'm representing this community or I'm working with this community, you're not. You're maybe working with an institution within it that claims to represent what is that community, right? That these are really complex fields, and because of that, I mean, our solution has been more of trying to work with deterritorialization, of going in and trying out what we think could be profitable within that complex social context, and then leaving, so that the next person can appropriate the space and have their say, what they think they should do, of trying to take a more public square position, which of course is a fantasy in itself. But the idea that the public space can evolve for different positionings, but make sure what you do does not leave a residue that stops that possibility of different positionings expressing themselves. And I think when you're in a complex situation, that's kind of the best you can hope for. But an idea of working with communities in complex society, I think that's a fantasy progressives tell themselves.
One there and then there. Thanks.
My question is...
Just wait for the mic.
Oh, thank you. Yes. My question refers to Dr. Ravi Agarwal from New Delhi, and this refers to our Ganges in India. The way I see that Indian MIT, so-called Indian MIT, went there and had a kind of campaign to clean up the mess what exists in Ganges. And I would like to know if there has been any success in this. And my second question will be the smog and the kinds of air pollution which exists in Indira Gandhi International Airport. I mean, I have not been there lately for the last 15 years, but the way I hear, it's really a very good solution for people to die left and right from lung disease. I mean, I'm a scientist myself. So I would like to know the progress made in this direction in Delhi regarding the Ganges and also the smog existing in the Calcutta versus this Delhi. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question here.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about what you said about community.
Sure.
I actually totally disagree with what you said. Because I believe that the way you talked about a community would be more like how you would describe a monoculture environment. Because in the wild, a complex community is really made up of biodiversity. You cannot have a symbiotic relationship unless there are complex relationships from afar. So I just don't understand
Well, one, I wouldn't confuse nature and this is a place where mixing those two things gets a little dangerous, right? When you start using social formations out of the natural world and putting them into the cultural world, the human world. But I do talk about it that way, and I think in terms of sociologically speaking, that's what a community is. It's like, and you can still see it in rural areas. There's still examples of it, where it's people that are probably pretty much of the same heritage and background, that share a very similar religion, that share a kind of rootedness in the land, in the landscape, right? That they probably have fairly similar political interests. And the way they tell one another is because they know one another. And they come from the same background, and that similarity gives them great solidarity, right? That they share those same rituals. And those that don't share them don't do well. This is why, like, you know, I have students, queer students from small towns, and they go, it was horrible there. I could not stay there. And it's because, well, yes, because you don't share in some of the certain narratives of this place where they expect a very strong adherence to the similar, and they exclude what is not of the same. That's a real sociological construction, and I'm putting it in somewhat of an ideal way, as opposed to where you get into very complex constructions where, yes, they all live in the same place. If you want to call that a community, proximity, I don't. I think community is much more meaningful and much more rich than proximity. Or that we have some kind of non-intentional relationship to one another.
Yeah, but I still think on a certain level, I see what you're saying, I agree with you.
Yeah.
But you forget the fact that people are dependent upon the natural world.
Yeah.
And that has to be inclusive of biodiversity and migration.
Well, I'm with you on the natural side of things, but I just think that you can't equate an intentionalized social sphere with a blindly evolving one, and to try and map one over the other has gotten us in some very bad places historically, really bad places.
Okay, I'm sure this is an issue that will recur over the conversation today.
Yeah.
But I don't know if either of you want to pick up on that question, or else, Ravi, for you to respond.
I'll just respond to the question which the gentleman there asked me. The short answer, it's a long conversation we can have over lunch if you like. It's a long but the short answer is no. But I'll add two interesting facts for that short answer. The background to that, as you know, is a committee of IITs formed to reformulate the Ganga action plan to clean up the river. And they are now stuck with the issue of what you might call ecological flows, that what is the minimum flow a river should have to be called a river. So that's what was people like us, and we also brought it to the table. And when you come to the idea of ecological flows, you're looking at a host of other issues which are not about just hydrological flows, but life-supporting flows. And what that ecological flow is going to be is a contentious question, because it changes the nature of structures you can build on the river and how much water you can stop or abstract. The second fact I'd like to add is 2 weeks back, the Uttaranchal High Court gave personhood to the 2 rivers, the Ganga and the Yamuna. Not only to the 2 rivers, but also to everything the rivers touched, the forest, the meadows, the tributaries. So pretty expansive, almost wild order. The problem with the order is, of course, that the personhood has to reside in some human being for it to be activated. And the human beings it resides in are the very officials which are developing the Ganga Action Plan. So. And on the second thing of smog, of course, I agree with you. It's life-threatening.
Great. Well, let's head for lunch and thank our panel for their remarkable work and responsive questions.